They called them HOA cops, a laughable term if it hadn't been for the genuine menace simmering behind their ill-fitting surplus store uniforms and the glint of unwarranted authority in their eyes. It began subtly, a poison seeping into the crisp air of my own forest. First, it was the passive-aggressive notes about unauthorized activity, which I later learned meant my hunting. Hunting on the land my grandfather had bought, the land where my forest cabin stood, a sentinel of solitude passed down through generations. I wasn't in their HOA, their freshly minted preserve at Whispering Pines neighborhood. A cancerous sprawl of beige conformity had merely metastasized uncomfortably close to my ancestral holdings. The irony was a bitter pill. They named their suburban enclave after the very pines they now sought to sanitize, to control my pines in my forest. Karen, the HOA president, a woman whose face seemed permanently molded into an expression of pursed disapproval and whose voice carried the grating certainty of the truly delusional, was the architect of this creeping siege. She'd sent her little enforcers, these HOA cops, to advise me. The first time, they'd found me cleaning my rifle on the porch of my forest cabin, the sun dappling through the ancient canopy. "Sir," the taller one, a man whose ambition clearly outstripped his intellect, had puffed, "This is a residential area. Firearms are discouraged." I'd looked out at the expanse of my forest, miles of it, stretching away from their pathetic little cul-de-sacs. "This," I'd said, my voice flat, each word a carefully placed stone, "is my property, and I will hunt on my land." They'd sputtered about bylaws, about community standards. I'd simply stared them down, the weight of generations who'd worked this land settling on my shoulders. They retreated then, but the air remained charged, the scent of ozone before a violent storm. They didn't understand. They couldn't. This wasn't just land. It was a sanctuary, a legacy. And my rifle wasn't a threat. It was a tool, a tradition, part of the compact between man and wilderness that their sterile little world could never comprehend. The initial warnings were like flies buzzing at the edge of hearing, annoying but ignorable. I continued to hunt in my forest, the familiar paths my own. But the flies grew bolder, their buzzing more insistent, morphing into the drone of something far more predatory. Karen's pronouncements, I heard through the reluctant grapevine of one or two older residents of the town nearby who hadn't yet been subsumed by the HOA's blandishments, were becoming more unhinged. Her obsession with my defiance, a festering sore on her inflated ego. She saw my forest cabin not as a piece of history, but as an affront, a rogue element in her meticulously planned diorama of suburban perfection. The quiet satisfaction of a successful hunt, the meditative ritual of field dressing, the scent of wood smoke from my cabin's chimney. These were becoming acts of rebellion, declarations of sovereignty in the face of their encroaching tyranny. I knew with a chilling certainty that this was only the preamble. They were testing the boundaries, not of the land, but of my resolve, and they were about to make a catastrophic miscalculation about the nature of the man they were provoking. The solitude of my forest was no longer peaceful. It was the calm before their manufactured storm, and I found myself listening not just for the snap of a twig indicating game, but for the crunch of tires on the access road I alone was supposed to use. The escalation, when it came, was swift and brutal, executed with the ham-fisted arrogance of petty tyrants tasting power for the first time. It was a Tuesday. Rain lashed down, turning my forest trails into slick ribbons of mud. I was inside my forest cabin, the wood stove crackling, a book in my lap, my rifle leaning oiled and ready in its customary corner. The pounding on the door was incongruous, a violation of the cabin's sanctity. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw them. 3 HOA cops this time, their cheap plastic ponchos gleaming, faces set in grim, self-important lines. Karen was with them, a grim reaper in a sensible raincoat, clutching a sheaf of papers like a death warrant. "Mr. Henderson," she'd shrieked over the wind, though I hadn't opened the door yet. "You are in violation! This is an eviction notice!" I opened the door slowly. My expression, I imagine, was one of cold curiosity. "Eviction? From my own forest cabin, Karen? On what grounds?" Her eyes, small and hard, darted to my rifle. "Illegal discharge of firearms within HOA jurisdiction. Unsanctioned presence on common land. Endangerment." The charges were a ludicrous tapestry woven from delusion and malice. "This is my land, Karen," I stated, my voice dangerously low. "Your jurisdiction ends where my property line begins, and you are currently trespassing on my property." One of the HOA cops, younger, more eager, stepped forward. "We have authority here. This area is now under protective covenant." He gestured vaguely at the surrounding forest. "You need to vacate, and we'll be confiscating that weapon." That was it. The rifle. Not just a tool, but a symbol. My grandfather's rifle. They were lucky, so incredibly lucky, that my fury was a cold, calculating thing, not a hot, immediate rage. If it had been, the forest floor might have drunk deep that day. Instead, I felt a profound, icy calm descend. They had crossed a line etched not in surveyors' maps, but in blood and memory. They were attempting to kick me off my property, to steal not just my peace, but my heritage. They blustered, they threatened, they waved their fraudulent papers. I offered no physical resistance. Let them play out their farce. They forced their way in, one of them clumsily grabbing my rifle, his hands sweating on the polished walnut stock. The indignity of it was a physical blow. They escorted me, a prisoner on my own land, to the edge of my forest, where their ridiculous little golf cart awaited. "You have 24 hours to remove your personal belongings." Karen spat, her face flushed with victory. "After that, this cabin will be secured as HOA property." Secured, as if they could ever truly possess it. As I walked away, drenched and disarmed, a resolve harder than iron forged itself in my gut. They thought they had won. They thought they had extinguished a nuisance. They had no idea. They had just declared war on a man who understood the terrain far better than they could ever imagine. A man for whom this forest was not just a backdrop, but the very bedrock of his existence. Their fatal error was not just their greed or their arrogance, but their ignorance. They had no idea who I was, or what I owned beyond that small, rustic forest cabin. The game had changed. They had used their fabricated rules. Now, I would use the real ones. The next morning, the rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and cold. I drove, not to my forest cabin to retrieve my belongings, as Karen had dictated, but to the county records office. The old, leather-bound ledgers, the digitized microfilm, they all sang the same silent song, a song of history, of ownership, of truth. My grandfather hadn't just bought the parcel of land where the cabin stood and the immediate surrounding forest. He'd been a man of foresight, a man who understood the value of buffers, of controlling one's environment. He had purchased the entire tract, the whole sprawling acreage upon which their preserve at Whispering Pines now squatted. Their neat little houses and manicured lawns, an ephemeral rash on the ancient skin of my land. My land. The full weight of it settled in. They hadn't just trespassed on a small section of my forest. Their entire neighborhood, every faux colonial facade, every obsessively edged driveway, was built on my property. The revelation wasn't a shout of triumph, not yet. It was a cold, hard, undeniable fact. A weapon of immense power that had just been placed in my hands. Later that day, I drove towards my forest, parking discreetly. I approached on foot, using game trails their HOA cops would never find. And then I saw it. A fence. a gleaming, aggressive, steel mesh fence slicing through my forest, brutally demarcating what they considered theirs from what they had stolen from me. It stretched as far as I could see, imprisoning the ancient trees, a scar upon the landscape. They had fenced off my entire forest, or at least the part they could reach, effectively annexing it. They'd put a fence around my sanctuary, my inheritance. The rage, the cold fury I'd felt the day before, now had a crystalline focus. This wasn't just about a cabin or a rifle anymore. This was about theft, blatant and arrogant, on a grand scale. They had kicked me off my property, then compounded the insult by physically walling it off. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. These people, led by their queen of delusion, Karen, were operating under the lethal misconception that their HOA charter was a sovereign decree, trumping decades of legal ownership and property rights. They hadn't just poked the bear, they'd tried to chain it, declaw it, and steal its cave. And they had done it all while living, unknowingly, as tenants on the bear's domain. The inner monologue began, a calm, precise enumeration of their transgressions, cross-referenced with the unassailable truth of the land deeds. Tactical retaliation wasn't just an option, it was a moral imperative. My hidden authority, the dormant power of being the true owner of the whole lot, was about to be awakened with seismic force. They had drawn their line with a fence. I would draw mine with the full, unyielding power of the law. The beauty of it was, their every action, their every overreach, was now a nail in their own coffin. The eviction, the confiscation of my rifle, the erection of that fence on my forest, each was a gift, a piece of evidence in the case I was already building in my mind. Their neighborhood, their precious HOA, was built on a foundation of ignorance, and now, illegal encroachment. The first call I made was to Arthur Fincher. Arthur was less a lawyer and more a legal pugilist, a man who relished a righteous fight, especially against bullies who weaponized bureaucracy. He was semi-retired, spending most of his time tending his award-winning roses, but the old fire still burned. I laid it all out for him in his sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of earth and blooms a stark contrast to the calculated malice of the HOA's actions. The initial eviction from my forest cabin, the confiscation of my rifle, the HOA cops, Karen's pronouncements, and then the pièce de résistance, the land deeds for the whole lot. Arthur listened, his sharp eyes, usually twinkling with amusement, hardening as the narrative unfolded. When I produced the original survey maps and the current title for the entire expanse of land their neighborhood occupied, he leaned back, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be," he breathed, the smile widening. "They actually did it. They built their entire fiefdom on your sovereign territory." His initial skepticism had vanished, replaced by a predatory gleam. "This isn't just trespass, my boy. This is grand larceny with a homeowners association." The tactical ops metaphor came naturally to Arthur, a former JAG officer. "Right," he said, tapping the deeds. "This is our beachhead. Their fence, that's their defensive line, and it's built on quicksand. Their bylaws, irrelevant, beyond demonstrating their intent." He began to pace, the energy of a coiled spring. "We don't just get your cabin back, or your rifle. We go for scorched earth. Legally speaking, of course." The "of course" was delivered with a wink that was pure, unadulterated menace. My dormant authority as the landowner was now being weaponized by one of the sharpest legal minds I knew. We spent hours dissecting their HOA incorporation papers, their CCRs, every piece of official-looking bump Karen had used to justify her reign of terror. It was, as Arthur gleefully pointed out, a house of cards built on the assumption that no one would ever call their bluff regarding the underlying land ownership of the whole lot. My grandfather, it turned out, had leased the land to a developer decades ago, with specific clauses the current HOA, in its arrogance, had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Assuming the lease had somehow translated into ownership for them, it hadn't. The lease had long since expired, reverting all rights unencumbered, back to the Henderson Family Trust, of which I was the sole trustee and beneficiary. The neighborhood wasn't just on my land. They were squatters, albeit well-heeled ones. Arthur's plan began to take shape, each step precise, each maneuver designed for maximum legal impact. First, we document everything, he instructed. The fence, the eviction notice, statements from anyone who witnessed their enforcement actions against your use of your forest. Then we serve them. Not with a polite request, but with a demand so financially catastrophic it'll make Karen's hair curl. Then we go for the eviction, all of them. The sheer, beautiful simplicity of it was breathtaking. They had tried to evict me from my own forest cabin. Now I would evict them from my land. The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. My family, my ancestors who had cherished this land, who had hunted this forest, would approve. This wasn't just revenge. It was the restoration of order. Arthur, for all his legal acumen, wasn't a field operative. For the next phase, Operation Document Storm, as he dramatically dubbed it, I needed someone with a different set of skills. That's where Marcus Maps Mallory came in. Maps was a local surveyor, a man whose obsession with boundaries, legal and geographical, bordered on the fanatical. He was also a quiet conspiracy theorist, convinced that HOAs were the shock troops of a creeping suburban dystopia. When I told him the situation, his eyes lit up with the fervor of a prophet vindicated. "I knew it," he'd exclaimed, nearly vibrating with excitement. "These planned communities, they're land grabs, pure and simple. They fence you in, then they fence you out." He became my sidekick, my tech-savvy ally in this strange suburban war. His surveying equipment, usually employed for mundane property disputes, became our reconnaissance tools. We used drones, his, of course, because he had 3, for various atmospheric conditions and levels of governmental scrutiny, to get high-resolution aerial photographs of the fence line snaking through my forest, clearly showing its encroachment, far beyond any conceivable boundary their pathetic plat maps might have indicated, even if they had owned the land, which they didn't. We documented the exact coordinates of the fence posts, the no trespassing signs they'd arrogantly erected on my property, facing outwards to keep me out of my own forest. Marcus even managed to get footage of the HOA cops patrolling the perimeter, their self-important swagger captured in glorious HD. He cross-referenced their schedules, identified the individuals, and compiled a dossier on each one that would have made a KGB handler proud. He unearthed records of HOA meetings, minutes where Karen had railroaded through motions to secure the perimeter and deal with the Henderson problem. His eccentricity was a finely honed weapon. He found disgruntled former residents of the neighborhood, people who'd run afoul of Karen's iron fist over the color of their mailbox or the height of their petunias, who were more than willing to provide affidavits about the HOA's pattern of harassment and overreach. Each piece of evidence was another cartridge in the legal shotgun Arthur was preparing to unload. The beauty of it was its meticulous legality. We weren't breaking any laws, we were simply documenting their flagrant, multifaceted violations of mine. The sheer volume of their transgressions, once compiled, was staggering. They hadn't just built their neighborhood on my land. They'd actively tried to dispossess me from the remaining portion of my property they hadn't yet consumed, attempting to seize my forest cabin and bar me from my forest. The whole lot was mine, and their fence was an act of war. The surveillance felt like a grim parody of the hunting I usually enjoyed in these woods. Instead of tracking deer, I was tracking the movements of these suburban predators, gathering the signs of their trespass, their spoor of legal violations. The zoom-ins on documents, the drone footage mapping their incursions, the text messages and emails Marcus somehow procured detailing their internal machinations. It was all building towards an undeniable truth. The local corruption ties weren't overt, but there was a faint whiff of complacency from certain county officials who seemed to have rubber-stamped the HOA's expansions without due diligence, perhaps swayed by the promise of increased property tax revenues from the new neighborhood. This, Arthur assured me, would be a delicate but necessary thread to pull later. The day Arthur filed the initial barrage of legal documents felt like the unleashing of a tactical strike. The first salvo was a cease and desist letter, delivered by a grim-faced process server to Karen personally during one of her meticulously orchestrated HOA Garden Committee meetings. Reports trickled back, via Marcus's network, of her face turning a rather spectacular shade of puce. The letter, penned with Arthur's most legally lethal prose, detailed the trespass, the illegal eviction from my forest cabin, the unlawful confiscation of my rifle, the construction of the fence on my property, and, most critically, the inconvenient fact that their entire neighborhood, their beloved preserve, was situated entirely on my land. Then came the demand for damages. Arthur, with a flourish, had calculated the cost of timber they'd implicitly stolen by denying me access to my forest, the emotional distress, the punitive damages for their willful and malicious conduct, and, of course, a hefty daily fee for the ongoing illegal occupation of my land, retroactive to the date their HOA was formed. The sum was designed to induce cardiac arrest, $1 million. A lien was immediately filed against the HOA's assets, whatever pitiful clubhouse and shared sprinkler system they collectively owned. The sheer, cold, calculated vengeance of it was exhilarating. A righteous fury channeled into precise, weaponized narration through legal filings. The effect on the preserve at Whispering Pines was, according to Marcus's gleeful updates, akin to a neutron bomb. Panic erupted. Emergency HOA meetings were called, devolving into shouting matches. Karen, initially defiant, tried to dismiss it as a frivolous scare tactic from a disgruntled individual. But the weight of the evidence, copies of which Arthur had thoughtfully included with the demand letter, the land deeds, the survey maps, the clear title to the whole lot in my name, was undeniable. The on-screen text of those legal filings, reproduced and circulated amongst the terrified residents, told a story far more compelling than Karen's bluster. The meticulously detailed claim for damages related to my inability to hunt in my forest, the loss of quiet enjoyment of my forest cabin, the sheer audacity of them fencing off my land. It was all there, a testament to their hubris. Some residents, the ones who had perhaps harbored doubts about Karen's crusade, started making panicked calls to their own lawyers, who quickly confirmed the grim reality. Their homes were, legally speaking, on very shaky ground. My property rights, so casually dismissed by Karen and her HOA cops, were now asserting themselves with the force of a tidal wave. The beauty of the strategy was its unassailable legality. They had used their perverted interpretation of rules to inflict harm. I was using the actual law to deliver justice. The cold-blooded calm I'd maintained was now mirrored in the surgical precision of Arthur's legal maneuvers. Each document was a scalpel, dissecting their pretensions, exposing the rot beneath their manicured lawns. The dramatic lighting change in my own emotional landscape was profound. The storm of anger had passed, leaving behind a clear, bright sky of impending, unavoidable reckoning for them. The $1 million fine and the liens were just the opening bombardment. The main assault was yet to come, the eviction of the entire HOA from my property. Arthur explained the process with grim satisfaction. Since their entire neighborhood, every last overpriced tract home, was built on my land without a current, valid lease or title. They were, in the eyes of the law, tenants at sufferance, or more accurately, trespassers on a colossal scale. We would serve eviction notices to every single homeowner. The silent majority of neighbors, those who had perhaps tittered amongst themselves about Karen's vendetta against the hermit in the woods, or who had silently benefited from the HOA's aggressive posture, were about to discover that complicity has a price. The paperwork was monumental. Each notice had to be individually prepared and legally served. Marcus, my eccentric ally, reveled in the logistics, cross-referencing property records, which were, ironically, now working against them, with the HOA's own membership roster to ensure no one was missed. He even designed a color-coded map of the neighborhood, each house marked for service, like targets on a military plan. The visual metaphor was potent. Their carefully planned community was now a kill box for legal papers. The process servers, a team hired by Arthur, descended on the preserve at Whispering Pines like a biblical plague. The reactions ranged from disbelief to hysteria. Doors were slammed. Tears were shed. Some tried to argue, to plead ignorance. Others, the more belligerent ones, threatened lawsuits of their own, empty threats from people standing on ground that wasn't theirs. The dramatic irony was exquisite. The HOA, an organization whose power was largely derived from its ability to fine, lien, and even initiate foreclosure proceedings against its own members for petty infractions, was now facing collective eviction. Karen, of course, attempted to rally her troops. She called emergency meetings, her voice, once shrill with authority, now tinged with a desperate quaver. She painted me as a villain, a greedy opportunist trying to steal their homes. But the truth, inconveniently backed by incontrovertible legal documents, copies of which found their way onto every doorstep alongside the eviction notices, was a stubborn thing. They had been kicked off my property, metaphorically, by their own president's actions leading to this. Now it was literal. My land, my forest cabin. These were not abstract concepts. They were tangible, and the rights attached to them were absolute. The law enforcement allies, in this case, were the county sheriff's deputies, who would eventually be tasked with overseeing the physical eviction if it came to that. Arthur had already liaised with the sheriff's department, providing them with copies of the court orders that would inevitably follow if the residents didn't vacate voluntarily. They were, as Arthur put it, reluctant but obligated to uphold the law, regardless of how many voters it might upset. The poetic justice was almost overwhelming. The fence they had erected to keep me out of my own forest now seemed to symbolize their own entrapment. They had sought to control a small piece of my world, and in doing so had forfeited theirs. The tactical precision of it all was deeply satisfying. Step 1. Establish undisputed ownership of the whole lot. Step 2. Document their trespass and illegal actions. Step 3. Deliver the financial shock. Step 4. Execute the legal eviction from my land. The climactic confrontation wasn't in a courtroom, not initially. It was at a hastily convened community emergency meeting in the HOA's undersized clubhouse, a building that, like everything else, stood on my property. Arthur and I attended, uninvited but legally unassailable. Our entrance caused a predictable stir. All eyes went to Karen, who was mid-rant, her face flushed, her voice cracking. She faltered, seeing us. The air crackled with hostility. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, pointing a trembling finger. Arthur smiled, a thin, cold slice of a smile. "Ms. Albright, We're here as representatives of the landowner. This landowner, he said, gesturing to me, given that this meeting is taking place on his property, without his permission, I'd say we have more right to be here than anyone. A murmur went through the crowd. Some glared. Others looked terrified. A few, I noted with grim satisfaction, looked utterly defeated. I stepped forward. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it carried through the suddenly silent room with the chilling clarity of a death knell. You, Karen, and your so-called HOA cops illegally entered my forest cabin. You illegally confiscated my rifle. You illegally tried to evict me from my own home. You illegally put a fence across my forest on my land. Each illegally was a hammer blow. You did all this while trespassing, every single one of you, on property that has been in my family for 3 generations. You built your neighborhood on my land. I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. You are so obsessed with your petty rules, your imaginary authority over a few square feet of my forest, that you never bothered to check who owned the whole lot. Your entire existence here, I swept my arm to encompass the room, the neighborhood beyond, is a trespass. Karen tried to speak, to bluster, but the words died in her throat. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. The public embarrassment was total. Her enforcers, the HOA cops, were nowhere to be seen, having wisely made themselves scarce. The $1 million fine levied against your HOA for damages and trespass stands. I continued, my tone flat, devoid of triumph, full of cold, hard fact. The eviction notices are legal and binding. You have 30 days to vacate my property. Someone shouted. You can't just kick us out of our homes. I'm not just kicking you out, I replied, my gaze unwavering. I am legally reclaiming what is mine. What you and your HOA president tried to steal a piece of, and what you all collectively benefited from the illegal occupation of, you trespassed, you overreached. You tried to take what wasn't yours from my forest, from my cabin. These are the consequences. The fight drained out of them. The arrogance, the entitlement, it all evaporated, leaving behind a residue of fear and dawning, horrified comprehension. Karen just stood there, broken, her reign of terror ending not with a bang, but with the rustle of eviction papers. The symbolic reclaiming of my forest cabin had already happened in my mind. The physical act would follow, unimpeded. The fence would come down. The true boundary lines, the ones on the deeds, would be respected. The 30 days passed, in a flurry of legal wrangling from a few desperate homeowners, all futile. The court upheld my ownership of the whole lot, affirmed the legality of the eviction notices, and validated the fine against the now-defunct HOA, whose coffers were, predictably, empty. Karen disappeared, rumored to have moved in with a sister in another state, her reign of suburban tyranny over. The day the last moving van pulled out of the preserve at Whispering Pines, an eerie quiet descended. The neighborhood, once bustling with self-important activity, stood empty, a ghost town on my land. The first thing I did was personally supervise the dismantling of that hideous fence. Each section that came down felt like a small victory, a piece of my forest breathing free again. The satisfying clang of metal on metal, the screech of posts being pulled from the earth, it was music. My forest cabin, which had been secured by the HOA with a cheap padlock, was easily reclaimed. My rifle was returned by the county sheriff, along with a grudging apology from a deputy who had been peripherally involved in the initial illegal confiscation. Stepping back into my cabin, the scent of old wood and memories welcoming me, was a moment of profound, somber resilience. The fight had taken its toll, not in blood, but in peace of mind, in the energy expended to reclaim what was always mine. As for the houses, the empty shells of their suburban dreams built on my property, Arthur presented several options. I could have bulldozed them, returned the land to its natural state, a tempting thought, but pragmatism and a certain sense of poetic justice prevailed. The $1 million judgment against the HOA was largely symbolic, as the entity itself was now a hollow shell. However, the houses themselves, fixtures on my land, became my assets to dispose of as I saw fit to recover actual damages and costs. I chose not to be wantonly destructive. After a thorough legal process, I sold them. Each one. Some went to auction, others to private buyers. The proceeds covered my legal fees, the initial fine, or at least a portion of what it represented in damages, and then some. I made sure the new deeds were ironclad, with clear boundaries, and no room for HOA-style overreach ever again. Perhaps some of the original residents, humbled and stripped of their HOA affiliation, bought their homes back, this time with a clear understanding of whose land they were on. I didn't particularly care to know. My focus was on my forest, my cabin, my peace. The porch light of my forest cabin, switched on that first night after the neighborhood emptied, was a beacon, a return to control. The locked gate at the entrance to my property, a new, sturdy one I installed myself, provided a sense of psychological closure. The faint, lingering scent of their manicured lawns and artificiality would fade in time, reclaimed by the wilder, truer scent of my forest. Looking back, the whole sordid affair feels like a fever dream, a suburban horror story that bled into reality. The righteous fury has cooled, replaced by a quiet, unshakable certainty in the sanctity of one's own domain. The moral cost of the action was the temporary loss of that tranquility, the necessity of engaging in a form of warfare, albeit legal, to defend what should never have been threatened. My forest is quiet again. The only sounds the wind in the pines, the call of a distant hawk, the occasional snap of a twig under my own boots as I hunt on my land. The experience was a brutal affirmation. Never mess with a man who knows his rights, who understands the power of the law when it is wielded with precision and backed by truth. They had sought to confine me, to define my existence by their petty regulations, to steal a piece of my heritage, me forest cabin, my ability to hunt, the sanctity of my forest. They failed to understand that the roots of my claim to this land ran deeper than any foundation they could pour for their hollow houses on the whole lot I owned. The legal battle was a tactical operation, each filing a carefully aimed shot, each court order a strategic gain. The surprise reversal, the revelation that their antagonist was, in fact, their landlord, was a moment of pure, cold, situational irony that even now brings a grim smile to my face. Their neighborhood, built as a monument to conformity and control, became a testament to their own folly. The symbolic revenge wasn't just in the eviction, or the fines, or the sale of their homes. It was in the restoration of silence to my forest, in the undisturbed peace of my forest cabin, in the knowledge that the land endures, and that justice, though sometimes slow and arduous, can be absolute. The only HOA cops here now are the chickadees scolding me from the branches, the only bylaws, the ancient rhythms of nature, and my rifle rests once more in its rightful place, a guardian of tradition, a symbol of sovereignty on my property, in my own forest, on my land, forever beyond their grasp. They learned, the hard way, that some lines should never be crossed, especially when those lines are etched onto land deeds held by someone who isn't afraid to enforce them with cold, calculated, and legally lethal precision.